Thank you, and it's absolutely great to be here. I'm going to apologise slightly up front for a slight cough I have. I may well be coughing a little bit during the presentation, but I am assured that I'm not contagious anymore, so that is good. My aim is to talk at you sounds terrible, but talk with you for around 20 to 25 minutes, probably aim for the 20-ish time, so then there's some time for questions afterwards. And I'm going to start with hopefully some basic information that is really useful to know. I'm currently working at the Mayor's Office for Policing and Crime. Out of pure interest, how many people here have heard of the Mayor's Office for Policing and Crime? I'm not surprised. The good news is after this session, everyone will be able to put their hands up. And although you may not have heard of the Mayor's Office for Police and Crime, you will, of course, have heard of the Mayor. And obviously the Mayor heads up London, and he's responsible for policing in London. He delegates that power to someone called Sophie Linden. She's a Deputy Mayor for Policing and Crime. And MOPAC is the statutory body that sets the budget and the direction of the Metropolitan Police. So that's kind of useful content. Without knowing that, you'll be going, who is this person speaking? Why is he doing policing research? Now, within MOPAC, Mayor's Office Police and Crime, there sits myself and my team. We call the Evidence and Insight team. There are around 22 of us, a mixture of social scientists, psychologists, criminologists, crime analysts, etc. Many of us, including myself, was based in the Metropolitan Police for many years. So I spent 5 years in the Met Police, before the previous mayor, now Prime Minister, pulled us away from the Met and kind of plopped us into City Hall, which, in my view, was the best thing he's ever done. And it worked incredibly for the unit to kind of broaden our horizons. We went from just focusing on crime to focusing on police and crime justice. We had a much broader remit. The whole point of the unit is to drive evidence base within policymaking, within MOPAC, and also, as part of our oversight abilities, to make sure what the Met Police are doing is evidence-based. And there are kind of three main areas of work, and I'll dip into each of those three main areas during the presentation. And I've got them on the slide here. So my unit do a whole host of social research and evaluations, a whole host of performance analytics and data visualization, and a number of pan-London surveys. So 3 big chunks of work we do, all using kind of Met data and some data that we develop and collect ourselves to really drive new insights and make sure that, as much as we can, that all the decisions made at City Hall are evidence-based and all the strategies developed at City Hall are evidence-based, which by and large they are, which is a really good position to be in as a researcher. Excuse me. Now, I wanted to start by just reflecting on something that I call the obliquely hidden gold mine, which whenever I say that, people go, what are you talking about, obliquely hidden gold mine? The point is that the Met Police and other police forces have an absolute gold mine of data. Absolute gold mine. But not many people will know about it. Not many students will know about it. Not many lecturers will know about it, etc. I would go so far in as much as saying that you don't have to be interested in policing to want to use police data. And I give 1 or 2 examples that kind of illustrates that. So on the slide, you can probably see, if your eyesight's pretty good, in the blue box on the left, a range of systems that the Met Police have. And these, between them, cover aspects around crime reporting, victims, witnesses, offenders, locations of crime, calls to police, vulnerable adults, vulnerable young people, stop and search, who is being stopped and searched, the officers who are conducting stop and search, offending history, etc. And I won't go through the names because that will get a little bit fairly boring, but the point is there's a whole host of systems. Now, I'm not here to say that accessing the systems is easy. It shouldn't be. There's lots of very sensitive information in there. My main point is that not many people know about it, Not many people know how to access them or the access routes, because there are access routes to those data. That doesn't mean you would need individual level of information of victims, for example, but there'd be routes in combination with kind of myself and colleagues at the Met to be able to access key information on, for example, if you're interested in victims with mental health, spread across London, trends over time, etc. There are routes that you can apply for the data. So my point is, it's very difficult to apply for data when you don't know it exists. And then the other point I have on this slide is a little triangle at the top right. And that's just me trying to show that my team used a lot of the metadata. We use a lot of data we develop ourselves, and I'll talk about that through our surveys during the presentation. But what we really try and do is layer on that theoretical conceptualization on top of the data. So it's not just using the data, it's, well, what theories are we bringing to this to be able to advance the conversations? And of course, you may be thinking, oh, police data, I've heard a lot about that. Isn't it meant to be pretty crap in terms of data quality? There are some points to that. It's completely determined by the officers recording data, putting it in correctly, and so on. But the point is, all data has error of a type, and when you're working with this data, as I have on the slide, we don't treat it as gospel. We work with the caveats. And even with that, it's still an organizational record of what the organization knows on a variety of key issues. So it's a wonderful goldmine that really should be opened up a little bit more. Hence, I'm so happy to be able to talk at this kind of event. So the next bit I want to talk about is where we start to use some of this data to generate insights across those three areas of work that I mentioned. So the first one being social research and evaluation. So within my team, there's a very heavy focus on evaluation. So what MOPAC does, or what the Met Police does, is it, one, evidence-based, and does it work? Does it reduce crime, or does it achieve what it's aiming to achieve? So my team's done around 40 evaluations, or have working on them at the moment, since 2015. There's a lot of evaluations, and that ranges from randomized controlled trials to much smaller results analysis pieces. So really wide, if you look at the hierarchy of evaluations, it is that broad. I'm not going to go through many examples on this slide. I have 3 on here, and I'll really only just touch on them very gently, just to kind of illustrate the kind of breadth that we have. So the first bubble on the top right is just kind of a very brief overview of a randomized controlled trial we did of the police officers wearing body-worn video. And body-worn video is a piece of innovation that police officers now wear routinely in London, thanks to this research. Essentially, officers wear it now, a little camera on their chest that records their interactions with the public or when they're arresting people or in certain key situations. We piloted that out in London, kind of 450 cameras to certain teams in the Met, equal number of individuals, the teams not receiving the cameras, and compared across on a whole host of factors. And the findings were fairly positive in terms of kind of reductions in complaints. The public were very, very positive about the technology. And as a result of that piece, the technology was rolled out across London. The real challenge on that piece, once again, is when we looked at the data. So what we had to do is essentially stitch together lots of data systems that were not used to talking to each other. So officer warrant ID, stop and search dashboard, so we can see how many stop and searches they were doing and their outcome. The arrest system, so we can stitch together all these layers of information. That was an absolute nightmare. That was the most difficult bit to do in that entire project. The randomization, that's easy. The stitching together all those bits of data was a real challenge. The second bubble is a piece of work that came out about 6 months ago that we did on the London, or the Met's gang matrix, which is a list of the Met Police's most violent gang members in London, and if what they're doing with them is effective or not. So once again, we had about 5,000 individuals over the last 5 years that received interventions from the Met Police. We're able to once again look at the offending system, especially what they're offending, before, during, and after the work they received against kind of a matched group. And the bottom example is just an evaluation we did, a quasi-experimental evaluation into offender management, trying to test whether this £11 million scheme that was implemented many years ago worked or not. Once again, we used the police systems, police national computer, to look at offending convictions compared to a very well-matched comparison group. The bad news for the people that designed the scheme is that it did not work. But of course, the research could tell them why it didn't work. They implemented it too quickly, the staff didn't have the right training, and so on. But when an organisation is willing to learn, which is something I'll touch on later on, negative findings can be just as powerful as positive findings. And I would argue even more so. Now, the next bit, so outside of conducting individual evaluations, which is really good, MOPAC has a very strong commissioning service. So as I have on the slide, the most recent year commissioning budget that MOPAC has is over £50 million. So it commissions a lot of stuff out in lots of key areas. My position is, wow, there's no way I can evaluate all of those different initiatives. It's just too much for a team of 20 people to evaluate when we've got lots of other pieces of the work we do. So the conversations become much more nuanced and much more interesting around, well, where should we prioritize the evaluation resource? What bits of commissioning that you're commissioning out really need to have a robust evaluation? That really need kind of the top of the triangle, which is my kind of impact value for money? And what maybe just needs kind of process evaluation in the middle or the bottom is just kind of key information being captured around inputs, outputs, deliverables. It's a much more nuanced conversation. And rather than just doing individual evaluations, what I've now done in MOPAC is say, well, every single thing that MOPAC commissions has to be capturing key information on what it is, whether it has a logic model, which is a huge change in how the organization's worked, how it's spending its money, what's it delivering, what's it achieving. And we developed a whole host of tools to help policymakers capture that information. We give evaluation training to the people that receive the money to try and kind of support and enable those individuals to do their own results analysis evaluation. Because I said, my team can't evaluate every single thing that MOPAC does. So it's a much more nuanced conversation and spreading the learning of that kind of systematic approach across the organization, rather than doing lots of individual evaluations. I also just wanted to touch on one or two examples of that kind of wider research that you may be interested in. That once again just showed the kind of stuff you can do using the data that's there. So a couple of months ago, we released the London Rate Review. It's a piece we did. We used to do it historically. I think it started in about 2006 when we were back at the Met. And we specifically code up hundreds of allegations of rape in any given. In this one, for example, was 500 allegations within one specific month in 2016. And we code them all up. And we used the crime recording system in the Met to code up everything we can around victim characteristics, perpetrator characteristics, offence, the procedural characteristics, and the case outcome. So we code that up from the Met data. So on one hand, you look at some fairly basic information, bottom left, in terms of some stats that came out. So majority of victims female, 41% of victims reported a mental health need, all the way down to 7% of suspects, but only 7% of suspects were a complete stranger. Or the length of time was on average 18 months from initial recording to trial outcome. So some really shocking statistics. You can also do some attrition charts. So top right just shows you of the 500 cases that came in, only 6% got to court. And the majority of cases were exited via victim withdrawal. So in nearly 60% of cases, the victims withdrew themselves. And then the next biggest chunk of withdrawal was the police decision not to take this any further. That's around 29%. The police went, no, we can't do anything else with this. Once again, that's all interesting. But when you've got a group of social scientists and statisticians, we can dig a little bit deeper. So, we did a whole host of regression analysis to understand, well, we can predict victim withdrawal. We can predict the police no further actioning, which are some of the bubbles at the bottom. So, for example, victims were 8 times more likely to withdraw when there were multiple officers in charge of the investigation. For example. And so this is stuff we then have conversations with the police about, with the deputy mayor, and there's actually a public meeting last week where we held the Met to account in terms of how can you improve some of these things? So an example of, yes, having the data, but then using it. I'll cover these two very, very quickly. And these are just 2 examples where I've stitched together different sources of metadata. So on the left-hand box is after the London disorder of 2011. We stitched together information on police, information on those that were arrested, into the previous criminal histories, stop and search, gang membership, and so on. And actually found that 71% of people that were arrested in the riots had some kind of criminal history, but they weren't particularly criminal, recent. The disorder pulled them back in. And only about 19% were linked to gangs. And on the right-hand side is a problem profile we did around mental health in the police after a fatal restraint that happened a few years ago. And we dug into the Met systems about what data they have on mental health, all the way to, a third of taser use in the Met a few years ago was linked to individuals experiencing mental health conditions. Well, it tells you a lot about how officers engage with individuals with mental health, potentially. So once again, it's using the data that exists and kind of reflecting that back internally to kind of share and drive learning. The next 2 chunks I'm going to talk about are much briefer, which is good, because I'm looking at my time here. This chunk is around some of the Pan-London surveys I mentioned, and this is a lot of the data we generate ourselves. There we go. So in MOPAC, we do 2 Pan-London surveys. How many people have heard of the CRAM survey for England and Wales? Okay, good. So essentially, one of those surveys is the London equivalent. So the CCW only has about 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 Londoners. The Public Attitude Survey, which is the one on the left, has nearly 13,000 a year, face-to-face, representative of London. Asks a whole host of questions around crime, policing, worry about crime, confidence, trust, etc. The one on the right is the User Satisfaction Survey, once again where we interview, so the Public Attitude Survey is face-to-face. The User Satisfaction Survey, we interview nearly 13,000 victims of crime over the telephone about their experience of being a victim. So it's all generated ourselves and completely shareable. So I'll just give 1 or 2 kind of key findings just to show how we use that data to extract key information that we give back to the Met to try and drive improvements. So for example, looking at the User Satisfaction Survey, if you look top left, you can see a fairly sharp decline in victim satisfaction over the last couple of years. It's dropped by around about 15 percentage points. We know a lot of reasons behind this. We know that especially victims that are dealt with over the telephone are way less satisfied. We know that repeat victims are way less satisfied. We know that victims with mental health issues are way less satisfied. We know that you have to meet victims' expectations. If you don't meet their expectations about what the police are going to do to investigate a crime, once again, satisfaction just drops through the floor. So once again, we can feed this information back to the police around how you're engaging and working better with victims. Oh, and I'll just cover this one really briefly because I really like it. And I've shown this slide to a number of people at the Met, senior officers, and they've gone, oh, wow. In the sense that this is victim satisfaction, and it splits getting a good service, so being told what's happening, being kept up to date, and specifically splits out those victims where their crime has resulted in an arrest or a charge versus those that haven't resulted in an arrest or a charge. So, for example, I've spoken to many senior officers that go, well, arresting someone is going to be a key driver of the victim being satisfied. No. And that's what this graph shows. So the 2 left-hand bars are if someone's been arrested or not, when they've had low kind of low good process, so to speak. So they haven't been given good process, where the right two bars are detected and undetected with a good process. So it's a victim receiving a good process, so being kept up to date, being told what's happened. That is more important than having the offender arrested, which is interesting for when the police engage with victims. And very briefly, I'll just touch on the second survey I mentioned, which is the public attitude survey, just to show how we kind of use it internally. So, for example, there's 150-odd questions in the survey. One of the things that has come out quite firmly recently is a real split between different groups in terms of their positivity or not towards the police. So this is just a chart. If you look at the top, it's got ethnicity down the side, some key questions along the top around, can the police be relied on? Did the police treat people fairly? Did the police deal with the issues that matter to you? Did they listen to concerns? And so on. And essentially what you see is, and for certain groups, they are way less positive about police. And you can split that down. It's specifically kind of the Black Caribbean group that are far less positive to police, whether that they think that the police treat people fairly or that they're dealing with the issues. So much so the chart at the bottom is, is the police organisation, is the Metropolitan Police an organisation that you can trust? The kind of the Black Caribbean group, 28 percentage points below the average. So we give this to the Deputy Mayor, who gives it to the Commissioner in terms of how are you engaging with certain community groups to improve relations? And then fairly quickly, the last chunk is around kind of the performance analytics that we do. Now let's give a very quick example. When I first joined MOPAC, the team at the time, driven by the previous mayor, now Prime Minister, their visions for success of the police, and what success looked like for them, were 6 specific targets. You had to increase confidence by 20%. You had to bring down certain crime types by 20%. They had the 20% number, and I think they just ran with it. That's not evidence-based way of working. And one of the things that I had to do when the new mayor came in was think, well, how do we change that? What should success look like for the mayor in his oversight role of the police? So, we wanted to get rid of targets because there's lots of literature out there about they kind of develop perverse incentives and what gets done gets measured and all that kind of stuff. And I wanted to go beyond just crime targets. I wanted to think about high harms and repeat victimization and equality. And I was able to do that. And what we kind of ended up with was a performance framework that looks a bit like this. I'm not going to go through this in a huge amount of detail, but the point is we brought things like the high harms and repeat victimization back on the table because they weren't really mentioned in those previous 6 targets. Because remember, in those olden days, you had to deal with these 7 crime types, even if you had them or not. What we did was develop an evidence-based series of tools, gave that to local areas, chief executives, police. They would then sit down and develop their own local crime priorities based on evidence. And that's what we measure them on. And then we also brought in learning from the surveys I've just mentioned and pulled things like victim satisfaction right at the top. Well, not the top. At the top of the middle box. We want victim satisfaction to improve, or a range of public perceptions to improve. And especially, as I have on here, challenge the inequalities that we see in those measures. So it went from, you've got to improve confidence by 20%, to, we've got a lot of inequalities here that we want you to think about, as well as think about the top-level measures. So a completely different way of working. And just out of interest, but all the information I've been given so far, all drives and informs our kind of oversight capacity. Because one of the things that we have to do, what the mayor and the deputy mayor have to do, is hold the police to account and have oversight of them for what they do. So everything we have feeds into a routine governance process, oversight boards, etc. One of the way we do that is through a whole host of data dashboards. So we have around, I can't remember, it's about 10 to 15 data dashboards of one type or another on the MOPAC website. So everything that's in the policing and crime plan that we help write, all those high harms, repeated victimization, local priorities, is measurable, and it's published, and it's transparent, and it's online. And this information, this is examples of dashboards we have, they're rooted into everyday meetings. They're rooted into knife crime boards, violence against women and crime, worked into violence against women and girls boards. So all those boards are, as much as they can be, evidence-based. So it's not just policy making in the dark. And then finally, there's the last two slides. I just wanted to offer one or two final reflections. One of the things that my team has done is really make a name for ourselves in challenging from within, politely, and upholding research integrity, and delivering negative findings where they exist. And the three little pictures I have on the right are three fairly well-known evaluations that all delivered very negative results. They were not popular. There's still ones of people that don't talk to me because they don't like some of the findings. So at this kind of event, what I always talk about is, find your voice, find your allies, and a thick skin. Because the biggest learning I had, both in the Met Police and now in MOPAC, is, I said, find your data allies and work with those that get it. And sometimes it can take years for change to happen. That's not a bad thing if it needs to take that long. So finally, I'm really proud of the craft of analytics, and I'm really happy in MOPAC that it's a largely evidence-based organization that wants evidence. The position I find myself in too often is I don't have enough people to deliver the amount of evidence that MOPAC want. As in, we need evaluations of everything. Well, let's prioritize, because I don't have infinite resource. And the fact that as data researchers, we've kind of gone beyond just the analysis into now program design and program delivery to really try and have a genuine influence about what the mayor does and what the deputy mayor does. But one of the things that I've worked with over the last few years is really that evidence for me doesn't root from the periphery, as I have on the slide. I really believe that a lot of the change, if you're looking for organizational change, and that's what we're trying to do in MOPAC, that has to be driven from the inside. And as analysts, we have an absolute key role to drive that change forward for the better. And sometimes that's a message that even my staff sometimes forget. So I always try and tell them not to forget that, because our role is essential. So thank you.
First, I say, well, I think you're one day behind me recovering from a cold. So well done for persevering. But also, I always say that one of the roles of a data analyst is to be an internal critical friend to that organization. So to say the truth to the organization, not to let them see the world as they'd like it to be. So I really warm to those. We've got time for one question at least before we is there anybody who wants to ask it? Yes, Simon.
A very general question. Have other mayors' offices set up an equivalent department?
Not particularly. So a lot of other PCCs and a lot of other police forces have kind of research departments of a kind. MOPAC is very different because it's by far the biggest PCC in the country. So most other PCCs don't have a unit. They might have one or two individuals, but not 20-something as the way we have. And they usually contract to commission out bits of research as much as they can, which is a shame because there really should be more of this.
And one other question. Yes, Alison.
You implied that, you mentioned that people, if they know about the data, they don't always know how to gain access to it. Can you say a little bit about how people should try, the routes that people should take if they're interested in finding out more?
Sure. So two things. If it's stuff from the surveys that I mentioned, like the public attitude survey, the user satisfaction survey, the easiest route is through me. And I'm here for the rest of the day. I've got card, email, all that's fine. If it's the metadata side, I can give the name of the individual. So when my team was in the Met, we used to kind of manage all of that access to the metadata. Obviously, it's changed a little bit recently with GDPR, but the roots are still there. So there's one specific individual, and it's kind of the gatekeeper for accessing metadata. So you can talk to that person. He's called Paul Clark. Once again, I can email anyone who wants that information. I'll give it in person afterwards. And that's the route, the application route to get the data. So much so that the Met recently released a kind of a business plan in the public, inviting people to start to talk to them more. It hasn't happened previously. So if you were to Google policing business plan and have some kind of recent years attached to that, you would find the Met going, these are some of our priorities. We'd really like to have a conversation about analytics or academics on them.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Paul. Thank you.